You just pour water.
Put that card away before you embarrass yourself. Nolan Voss said it loudly enough for the donors nearest the head table to hear. Miriam Bell stood beneath the crystal lights of the Boston Hospital Foundation ballroom, still wearing the black service jacket she had worked in all evening. In one hand, she held a small platinum reservation card. In the other, she balanced an empty silver tray against her hip. Nolan plucked the card from her fingers and examined it with a thin smile. "This dinner is for people worth 8 figures," he said. "Not tray carriers who wander into the wrong section." A donor near the aisle stopped adjusting his cufflinks. Another lowered her champagne glass. Behind Nolan 11 chairs waited around the head table, each place setting marked with hand-lettered cards and polished silver. One chair remained empty. Miriam did not reach for the card. "My name is on the reservation," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried farther than Nolan expected. He checked the engraved name again. Miriam Bell. Then he laughed. Someone in reservations made a mistake. He held the card between 2 fingers as though it had been dropped on the kitchen floor. Miriam had spent 6 hours serving coffee, replacing forks, guiding guests through last-minute seating changes, and calming donors who had arrived to find their tables altered. Most of the room knew her only as the older widow who moved carefully and never complained. Nolan wanted them to remember exactly that. He had been promoted to event captain 3 weeks earlier, and tonight, he wore the title like a medal. He had spent the reception calling servers by numbers, correcting them in front of guests, and laughing too eagerly at every wealthy man's joke. Now he had found a better performance. He lifted the card so the nearby donors could see it. Platinum access, he announced, head table seating, private reception privileges. Apparently, Mrs. Bell has had a very successful evening carrying soup. A few people shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed. That only sharpened Nolan's smile. He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the insult feel personal while keeping it public. "You lost your husband, Miriam. That doesn't mean you've lost your sense of place." Her fingers tightened around the tray. For 1 second, the ballroom seemed to narrow around her. The gold curtains, the white roses, the orchestra warming softly near the stage. At the far end of the room, a screen displayed the Hospital Foundation's campaign goal in bright numbers. The pledge appeal would begin in 20 minutes. Millions of dollars depended on what happened after the guests took their seats, and Nolan had no idea how close the entire dinner was to collapsing. Miriam studied the empty chair at the head table. Its place card had been removed. The seating arrangement around it was wrong. 3 donors separated who had specifically asked to sit together. One major benefactor placed beside a trustee he had refused to speak with, and the foundation chair stranded 2 tables away from the people she needed for the appeal. Changes Miriam had corrected that afternoon had been reversed. Not accidentally. Nolan followed her gaze. "Don't start checking my tables," he warned. "You're done serving this section." "That arrangement won't hold," Miriam said. His smile disappeared. "What did you say?" "The pledge flow depends on those seats." A camera light blinked near the stage. One of the hospital trustees stopped speaking mid-sentence. Nolan glanced around, aware that too many important people were listening. Then he pressed the platinum card flat against Miriam's tray. "You pour water," he said. "I run the room." Miriam finally took the card back. The edge had bent beneath his thumb. She smoothed it once, carefully, as if the damage mattered for reasons no one there could understand. Then she reached inside her service folder. Nolan's hand shot out and closed over the folder before she could open it. "Whatever complaint you think you're making can wait until tomorrow." "It can't. The appeal starts in 20 minutes. "I know." Something in the way she answered made the foundation chair, Evelyn Hart, rise from her seat across the ballroom. Nolan noticed. His grip loosened. Miriam pulled the folder free. Inside were only 2 items, the final foundation dinner roster and a stapled donor seating change log filled with Time's initials and handwritten corrections. Nolan's eyes landed on the first page. For the first time that evening, his confidence slipped. He recovered quickly. "Kitchen paperwork," he said louder now. Nothing more. But Miriam was no longer speaking to him. She faced Evelyn Hart as the foundation chair approached the head table. "I need you to see who changed these seats," Miriam said, "and what happened before they were changed." Nolan moved between them. "This employee is confused." Evelyn did not answer him. Her attention remained on the folder in Miriam's hands and on the platinum reservation card bearing Miriam's name. Around them, conversations faded one by one. Nolan had intended to remind a widow of her place. Before the pledge appeal began, the roster would reveal who had actually saved the dinner, why the empty head table chair belonged to Miriam, and which man was about to lose the authority he had used to humiliate her. But to understand how a banquet server came to hold the entire night together, the story had to return to 3 weeks earlier, before the platinum card, before the public insult, and before Nolan Voss realized the quietest woman in the ballroom knew more about the event than he did. 3 weeks earlier, Miriam Bell arrived at the hospital ballroom before sunrise with a thermos of coffee and a folded black service jacket over one arm. The room was still unfinished then. Tables stood bare beneath the chandeliers. Florists, carried in white roses by the bucket electricians, tested the stage lights, and a rental crew rolled stacks of gold chairs across the carpet. Miriam preferred the ballroom at that hour. Before the donors arrived, no one cared who had money and who carried trays. A table was simply a table. A chair belonged wherever it helped the room work. She placed her thermos beside the service station and began checking the place settings. Knife blades faced inward. Water glasses sat above the dinner knives. Salt cellars were filled. One chair at table 9 rocked slightly, so she folded a thin square of cardboard and pressed it beneath the short leg. It was the kind of problem most people never noticed after it had been solved. Miriam had spent 31 years making sure they never noticed. Her husband, Samuel, used to say she could walk into a crowded room and see its weak points before anyone else saw the room itself. A blocked doorway. A nervous guest seated too far from the exit. Two relatives placed together who had not spoken in years. A server assigned 12 plates while another carried 6. Samuel had worked maintenance at the hospital until cancer put him in one of its rooms. For 14 months, Miriam moved between his bedside and the banquet halls where she earned their insurance payments, rent, and prescription money. The foundation had helped cover a treatment their policy rejected. Samuel still died. But Miriam never forgot the night a hospital social worker quietly told her the remaining bill had been paid. After the funeral, she kept working foundation events. Not from gratitude alone. Gratitude was too simple a word for a debt tied to grief. She worked because Samuel had once squeezed her hand beneath a hospital blanket and said, "When people give, somebody has to make sure the giving reaches the right place." That sentence had stayed with her longer than his voice. Near 8 o'clock, Nolan Voss entered the ballroom carrying a leather clipboard and wearing a new navy suit. Until that month, he had been another banquet server. He was younger than Miriam by nearly 20 years and quick enough to remember every donor's title, favorite drink, and estimated net worth. Now he had been named event captain. He crossed the room without greeting the setup crew. "Miriam," he called, "I need you on service inventory." She paused beside the seating chart. "I was assigned to guest flow. I changed it." "Why?" "Because inventory is where I need you." His tone made clear that the decision was not about inventory. Miriam set down the chart. Nolan enjoyed being watched. Even in an empty ballroom, he spoke as though an audience had gathered around him. "The foundation wants a more polished event this year," he said. "Less improvising, clear authority. Everyone staying in their lane." Miriam studied the clipboard beneath his arm. The top page showed the head table arrangement. 3 names were already crossed out. "Who changed the donor placements?" she asked. "I did." "Did Evelyn approve it?" "I don't need the foundation chair approving every chair." "You moved Arthur Dane away from the cardiology trustees. He donated $12 million. He should sit with people at his level. He asked to sit beside the surgical team." Nolan's mouth tightened. "This is exactly what I mean. You serve the tables, Miriam, you don't design them." A rental worker nearby slowed for half a second, then continued stacking chairs. Miriam did not argue. She had learned that some people mistook silence for surrender because they had never seen what quiet people did after leaving the room. By noon, she was in the basement counting wine glasses. The inventory sheet required 480. The storage racks held 462, including 7 with chipped rims. Miriam wrote the shortage clearly and carried the sheet upstairs. Nolan barely glanced at it. "Use what we have. We'll run short during the pledge reception. Then wash faster. The kitchen sinks can't turn 18 glasses during service." He tapped the clipboard against his palm. "You will worry too much. Miriam knew better. A shortage rarely remained one shortage. It became delayed, drinks, crowded service stations, irritated donors, distracted staff, and an appeal beginning in a room that no longer felt generous. She returned downstairs and called the rental supplier herself. The replacement glasses could be delivered, but only if the request came from event leadership. Nolan refused to authorize it. At lunch, Miriam sat alone near the loading dock with a container of soup she had brought from home. Her apartment rent had increased again that spring. Samuel's final medical payments still came out of her account every month, though the hospital had reduced most of the debt. She owned little beyond the furniture they had bought together and a narrow silver watch that no longer kept perfect time. Inside her wallet behind Samuel's last photograph, she kept a small card from the foundation. It was platinum-colored, heavier than an ordinary invitation, and engraved with her name. Evelyn Hart had given it to her after a smaller donor luncheon the previous year. "I'll belong in the room too," Evelyn had said. Miriam had never used it. The card granted access to the private reception and a reserved place at the foundation dinner, but attending as a guest would have meant giving up a paid shift. Paid shifts covered groceries, so the card remained hidden behind Samuel's photograph, a promise she could not afford to accept. That afternoon, Miriam returned upstairs and found the ballroom seating chart covered in Nolan's handwriting. He had rearranged nearly a third of the room. Prestigious names had been pulled toward the stage. Smaller donors had been pushed outward. Hospital staff had been separated from the families whose stories would anchor the pledge appeal. The arrangement looked impressive. It would not work. Evelyn Hart entered through the side door, speaking rapidly into her phone. Her expression was controlled, but Miriam recognized panic when it wore professional clothes. 2 major donors had threatened to withdraw. A third had refused to attend unless the seating was corrected. The dinner was still 3 weeks away, yet the foundation was already losing the people the night depended on. Evelyn ended the call and pressed a hand against the back of a chair. "Nolan says the problem is handled." Miriam glanced at his chart. "No," she said, "it's only hidden." Evelyn studied her. "What do you see?" Miriam hesitated. Giving the honest answer could cost her shifts. Staying silent could cost the hospital far more. She pulled an unused roster sheet from the service station and placed it beside the seating chart. "Give me 1 hour," she said. That was the moment the quiet banquet server stopped, merely noticing the weak points in the room, and began rebuilding the entire dinner around them. Miriam spent the next hour at a linen-covered table near the back wall, working with a pencil, the donor roster, and a stack of old seating notes. She did not begin by ranking people according to wealth. She began with relationships. Arthur Dane had funded cardiac research after his daughter survived emergency surgery. He should sit near the doctors who had treated her, not beside investors he barely knew. A retired teacher named Louise Grant had given modest amounts for 22 years. She belonged near the family whose child had received a foundation-funded transplant because Louise always increased her pledge when she could see exactly whom the money helped. 2 trustees who appeared friendly in photographs had not spoken since a dispute over the new cancer wing. Placing them together could poison an entire table. Miriam marked each connection in the margins. She linked donors to physicians to patient families, and longtime supporters to first-time guests who needed someone welcoming beside them. Then she redesigned the pledge sequence. The largest appeals would not come first. Miriam placed personal stories between them, allowing the room to breathe. She moved the foundation chair closer to the families she needed to acknowledge and created a path for pledge cards to reach the collection team without servers crossing in front of the stage. By the time Evelyn Hart returned, the new arrangement covered 6 pages. Evelyn read them without speaking. "This is more detailed than the planner's file," she finally said. "It needs to be." "Where did you learn to do this?" Miriam rested her pencil beside the roster. 31 years of watching people leave dinners early. A small smile touched Evelyn's face, then vanished. She pointed to one name. "Arthur Dane's office called again. He says Nolan promised him the center seat at the head table. I doesn't want the center seat." He told Nolan he did. He told Nolan he wanted access to Dr. Sayegh before the appeal. Nolan heard head table because that was the part he understood. Evelyn considered this, then called Arthur's assistant. 2 minutes later, she ended the conversation. Miriam had been right. Evelyn gathered the pages into a neat stack. "I want you to finish this. I'm scheduled in service. I'll approve the extra hours. Nolan won't like it." This dinner is not being held for Nolan. But Nolan behaved as though it were. When he returned and found Miriam's draft beside Evelyn's notes, his expression hardened. You gave her my roster. Evelyn remained calm. I gave Miriam permission to solve the problem. There wasn't a problem. We nearly lost 3 major donors this morning. Because people like Dane enjoy making demands. Then why did Miriam understand what he wanted? Nolan's jaw moved before any words came. Miriam collected her pencil and stepped away from the table. She had no interest in watching Evelyn embarrass him. Nolan stopped her near the service doors. You went around me. Evelyn asked me a question, and you made me look incompetent. I answered honestly. His voice dropped. You think arranging chairs makes you an event director? No. Good. He leaned close enough for her to smell coffee on his breath. You're useful because you know where the extra napkins are. Don't confuse being useful with being important. Miriam held his gaze. Those are usually confused by people who have never had to be useful. A banquet worker passing with a card hid a smile. Nolan saw it. The private insecurity beneath his polished manner surfaced for only a second. He had wanted the promotion because he believed authority would erase every year he had spent being ignored by wealthy guests. Instead, Miriam's competence reminded him that a title could not create judgment. By the following week, he had begun tightening control over the staff. Every change required his initials. Servers could no longer speak directly to Foundation employees. Questions had to move through him even when he was unavailable. He created a rule that no service worker could enter the donor reception without a silver access badge. Miriam's badge disappeared twice. The first time, Nolan claimed she had misplaced it. The second time, he made her wait outside the ballroom while younger servers carried in the revised place cards she had prepared. Through the glass doors, she watched one of them place 2 cards at the wrong table. She tapped softly on the glass. Nolan noticed and deliberately continued speaking to a florist. 5 minutes later, Evelyn found Miriam outside. Why aren't you in the room? I don't have a badge. You're on the planning list. Nolan says planning access doesn't apply to service staff. Evelyn's mouth tightened. She opened the door herself. That evening, Nolan issued a new instruction. Miriam could assist with seating preparation, but her name would not appear on planning documents. Too many people editing the same file creates confusion, he told the staff. The explanation sounded reasonable. That was why systems like his worked. He rarely gave an order cruel enough to challenge openly. He wrapped each small injustice in efficiency hierarchy or presentation. And because he wore the captain's pin, most people accepted the wrapping. Miriam continued working. She called donors during breaks, confirming dietary needs and personal requests. She discovered that one benefactor used a cane, but had been assigned a chair behind a decorative column. Another needed to leave early for dialysis and required a clear path to the exit. None of these details appeared on Nolan's prestige-based chart. Miriam added them to the roster. Beside every adjustment, she recorded the date, time, reason, and person who approved it. The donor seating changelog began as protection against confusion. It soon became protection against Nolan. One afternoon, Miriam returned from the kitchen and found 3 pages missing. Nolan stood near the copier, feeding papers into a shred bin. Her pace quickened. What did you remove? Old drafts. They were approved changes. They were clutter. Miriam reached for the remaining pages. He placed his palm over them. You need to learn when a decision is finished. The donors confirmed those seats. I changed them back. Why? Because the room should reflect the Foundation's priorities. The donors are the Foundation's priorities. No, the people who can write the largest checks are. Miriam's voice stayed level. And what happens when they leave before the appeal? Nolan withdrew his hand. They won't. She gathered the surviving pages. For a moment, the top sheet exposed Evelyn Hart's handwritten note. Miriam's pledge sequence approved. Use her final roster. Nolan saw it. A smile thinned across his face. Then the paper disappeared beneath the others. Miriam could have walked away. The additional hours barely covered the transit costs, and every day under Nolan's authority made the job harder. But the dinner would fund patient lodging, emergency treatments, and transportation for families who could not afford to cross Boston for care. Samuel had used one of those programs during his final winter. Leaving would protect her pride. Staying might protect someone else's husband. So Miriam made a second copy of the roster and hid it inside an ordinary service folder. She duplicated the changelog and kept it separate from Nolan's files. Then she placed both beneath the spare linen inventory in the locked banquet office. For the first time, she was no longer documenting mistakes so they could be corrected. She was preserving proof because she understood someone intended to erase it. 10 days before the dinner, Miriam arrived to find her service folder open on Nolan's desk. The roster was still inside. The donor seating change log was not. Nolan stood beside the ballroom stage, giving instructions to the lighting crew as though nothing had happened. Miriam waited until he finished. "Where is the log?" He checked his watch. "What log?" "The record of approved seating changes. If it mattered, it would be in the official file." "It was in my folder." "Then perhaps you misplaced it." She knew the answer was meant to provoke her. Nolan wanted anger because anger could be reported. Calm competence was harder to punish. Miriam walked to the copier room and searched the recycling bin. The top layer held rehearsal schedules and floral invoices. Beneath them, torn into 4 pieces, she found the first page of the log. The remaining pages were gone. She carried the pieces back into the ballroom and laid them on Nolan's clipboard. "You'd destroyed an approved record." He barely glanced down. "I removed an unofficial document created by a server. It tracked donor instruction. It tracked your opinions. Then why tear it up?" His voice sharpened. "Because this event needs one captain." Several workers nearby became suddenly absorbed in their tasks. Miriam gathered the pieces. "You can be the captain," she said, "but the room still has to work." Nolan gave a quiet laugh. "You keep speaking as though those are separate things." By lunchtime, Miriam had reconstructed most of the missing information from memory. She called donor assistants during her break, confirmed the seating requests again, and rewrote each entry with times and initials. Evelyn Hart approved the rebuilt log before leaving for a board meeting. Then Nolan issued another change. All donor communications would now go through him. Miriam was removed from the call list. The decision cost the event its clearest warning. That afternoon, Arthur Dane's assistant called to say he would leave before the pledge appeal unless his seat beside Dr. Saye was confirmed. Nolan accepted the message, wrote nothing down, and told the assistant everything was arranged. It was not. Arthur's name still appeared at the center of the head table, separated from the doctor by 6 seats and a decorative arrangement tall enough to block conversation. When Miriam pointed this out, Nolan closed the seating book. "I handled it. You promised him something the chart doesn't show. I know how to speak to donors. Speaking is not the same as listening." A voice behind them said, "Is there a problem?" Evelyn had entered unnoticed. Nolan smiled immediately. "Just a minor service question." Miriam could have corrected him. Instead, she opened the seating book and showed Evelyn Arthur's placement. Evelyn's expression changed. "I approved the revised table yesterday." Nolan lifted both hands. "We cannot rebuild the ballroom every time a donor changes his mind." "He did not change his mind," Miriam said. "You changed the seat." Evelyn examined the page more closely. There were no approval initials beside the alteration. Nolan restored Miriam's arrangement. His smile held but only just. "Of course." He waited until Evelyn left before leaning toward Miriam. "You enjoy making me look small." "No," she said. "You keep choosing rooms with witnesses." That evening, Nolan reassigned her from donor seating to the far service corridor. Her new task was checking hot boxes and counting dessert forks. It removed her from the room where final decisions were being made, but it did not remove her from their consequences. Through the kitchen doors, she heard servers discussing new table numbers that did not match the approved roster. At table 4, a pediatric surgeon had been moved away from the family whose story introduced the appeal. At table 7, 2 donors with a history of public disagreement had been placed side by side. At the head table, Evelyn's chair had been shifted toward the far end, leaving Nolan closest to the microphone and the largest contributors. The arrangement was no longer about fundraising. It was about being photographed beside money. Miriam wrote each change on a fresh sheet. A young server named Tessa noticed. "You're still tracking them. Someone has to. He'll take it again, only if he finds it." Tessa lowered her voice. "People are saying you're trying to take his job." Miriam counted another stack of forks. "I'm trying to keep his job from costing the hospital." The next morning, the foundation received its first withdrawal. Louise Grant, the retired teacher who had attended for 22 years, canceled after receiving a revised place card that moved her to the rear of the ballroom. Her annual donation was not the largest. Her absence mattered anyway. Louise brought former students, wrote handwritten notes to patient families, and persuaded other modest donors that small gifts belonged beside large ones. Miriam called her from the loading dock. Louise answered on the fifth ring. I was told the front tables were needed for important guests, she said. Who told you that? The young event captain. Miriam closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Grant, your place was approved beside the transplant family. Not anymore. I can correct it. The older woman's voice softened. You should not have to fight someone to prove I belong in a chair. After the call, Miriam stood beside the loading bay as cold rain struck the pavement beyond the awning. She understood then that fixing the seating chart would not be enough. Nolan was not simply making mistakes. I was teaching people where he believed they belonged. The same lesson he had been trying to teach her. Miriam returned upstairs and found Evelyn in the foundation office. She explained what had happened and placed the reconstructed log on the desk. Evelyn read the entry twice. This cannot continue. The dinner is in 9 days. I can remove him. If you do it now, he'll say the roster was unstable because too many people interfered. Evelyn studied her. You are protecting him. I'm protecting the event from his excuse. What do you suggest? Miriam opened the final roster. Freeze the seating today. Every change after this must have a time, reason, and signature. Evelyn nodded slowly. And if Nolan changes it anyway, then the record will show who did it. That was Miriam's quiet, active step. She was no longer repairing Nolan's damage invisibly. She was building a chain of proof he could not dismiss as kitchen gossip. Evelyn signed the roster. Miriam signed beneath her. A third line remained for the event captain. Nolan refused. This is unnecessary bureaucracy, he said when Evelyn presented it. It is accountability, Evelyn replied. I took the pen only after 2 trustees entered the office. His signature appeared hard and slanted across the page. For 3 days, the frozen roster held. Donors reconfirmed. Louise Grant agreed to attend. Arthur Dane's assistant approved the revised placement. The pledge sequence moved cleanly from patient story to medical need to giving opportunity. Then, 48 hours before the dinner, Nolan changed nearly every critical seat again. I did it after business hours. He replaced the approved roster in the ballroom binder, sent revised place cards to printing, and listed the alterations as executive presentation adjustments. By morning, the new cards were already on their way. Miriam discovered the switch at 6:20 a.m. The practical threat was immediate. Reprinting would cost money. The foundation had not budgeted. Calling donors again risked exposing internal disorder. Leaving the changes untouched could collapse the pledge flow in front of 400 guests. Nolan found her comparing the 2 rosters. You have a choice, he said. Serve the dinner or keep pretending you planned it. Miriam held up the signed frozen version. You altered this after approval. I improved it. You separated every relationship the appeal depends on. I place the most valuable people where they can be seen. They are not decorations. His voice dropped. Be careful. I control the service schedule. One more accusation and you won't work foundation events again. The threat reached beyond one evening. Those shifts paid Miriam's medical debt. They paid her rent. They kept her connected to the hospital where Samuel had spent his final year. Walking away would preserve her dignity and end the fight. Staying meant risking the little stability she had left. Miriam placed both rosters side by side and began marking every unauthorized change. Nolan watched her. You really think a stack of paper will save you? No, she said, but it may save the dinner. She made 3 copies. One went into Evelyn's locked cabinet. One stayed with the foundation office. The third went into her plain service folder beside the rebuilt donor seating change log. Then Miriam returned to the ballroom and helped place 400 chairs according to Nolan's version. To everyone watching, it appeared she had lost. But beneath the linen inventory inside a folder, no one considered important she had preserved the exact moment Nolan chose status over service. And the next time he tried to erase her work, the room would already be counting down to an appeal he could no longer afford to ruin. On the night of the foundation dinner, the approved roster disappeared from the ballroom binder at 6:42 p.m. By 7, 400 guests had entered beneath the chandeliers. By 7:15, Nolan had placed Miriam in the far service corridor and warned the staff that only he could authorize seating changes. At 7:25, Miriam found the platinum reservation card tucked behind Samuel's photograph in her wallet. For 3 weeks, she had intended to work the dinner and leave the card unused. Then a donor stopped her beside table 9. Arthur Dane was a broad-shouldered man in his 70s who carried no visible sign of his wealth except the number of people who made space when he approached. Mrs. Bell, he said, reading her name tag. Where is Dr. Saye? Miriam glanced toward the head table. The doctor had been seated 6 chairs away, blocked by a tall arrangement of white roses. I'll find him for you. I was told we would sit together. You were. Arthur followed her gaze. Was that changed? Before Miriam could answer, Nolan appeared. Mr. Dane, everything has been arranged according to Foundation protocol. Arthur's attention remained on Miriam. Is that true? Nolan answered for her. Mrs. Bell is part of the service staff. She would not be involved in donor placement. Miriam could have exposed the alteration then. The room was filling quickly, however, and challenging Nolan in the aisle would delay seating while offering no proof he could not dismiss. I'll bring Dr. Saeg to you before the appeal, she said. Arthur studied her for a moment. See that you do. Nolan waited until he walked away. You are not to make promises to donors. It was already promised. By whom? You signed the frozen roster. His eyes sharpened. That document was replaced, without Foundation approval. Careful. He indicated the crowded room with a small movement of his chin. One scene from you tonight, and I'll make certain every banquet company in Boston hears that you became unstable after your husband died. The threat struck with more precision than shouting would have. Miriam felt Samuel's photograph against the lining of her wallet. Nolan had used her grief before, but never as a weapon against her livelihood. She took a slow breath. You should not say things you would be ashamed to hear repeated. I'm not ashamed of facts. No, Miriam said. Only records. A waiter approached to report that Louise Grant had refused her assigned seat near the kitchen doors. Nolan sent Miriam to handle it. Louise stood beside table 27, gripping the strap of her small handbag. Around her, guests were already settling into their places. My card says table 7, she said. It should. This young man told me the front section was reorganized. The young man was Nolan. Miriam checked the printed place card. Louise's name had been replaced at table 7 by the chief executive of a company that had never donated to the hospital before that evening. I can move you back, Miriam said. Will someone else be embarrassed when you do? The question stopped her. Every correction now displaced another guest. Nolan had promised a better seat. The changes had been designed so that repairing one injury created another. I'll find a way that does not make you carry his mistake, Miriam said. Louise's expression softened. That is what you always do. Before Miriam could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed twice the signal for guests to take their seats. The appeal would begin in 20 minutes. Miriam moved quickly through the room. She brought Dr. Saye to Arthur Dane before the first course. She placed Louise temporarily beside a former student who welcomed her without hesitation. She guided the transplant family closer to the stage, so their walk to the microphone would not cut through service traffic. Each small repair kept the dinner moving. Each one also made Nolan angrier. At 7:38, he stopped her near the head table. You are finished in this room. The patient family needs the aisle seat. I gave you an instruction, and I corrected the access problem. He took the service tray from her hands and passed it to another server. You're going back to the kitchen. Miriam's gaze went to the empty chair at the head table. Her name had been removed from the place setting. She understood then that Nolan had not merely found the platinum card. He had known about it before the doors opened. Evelyn Hart had reserved that seat after Miriam rebuilt the dinner plan. The card was not a mistake or a charitable gesture. It was the Foundation chair's quiet acknowledgement that the woman responsible for the evening should be present when the appeal began. Nolan had removed the place card because Miriam's presence at the head table would invite questions he could not answer. You took my name, she said. I corrected another misunderstanding. You knew I was invited. He glanced around to make sure donors were near enough to hear. Then he raised his voice. Put that card away before you embarrass yourself. The nearest conversations weakened. Nolan took the platinum reservation card from Miriam's fingers and sneered at the engraved name. This dinner is for people worth 8 figures, he said. Not tray carriers who wander into the wrong section. The insult traveled farther than he intended. Arthur Dane stopped speaking. Louise Grant rose halfway from her chair. A trustee near the stage lowered his phone. Miriam held the empty tray against her hip while Nolan announced her access level to the surrounding donors and joked that carrying soup must now qualify someone for the head table. No one laughed. His smile hardened. Then he leaned close and used Samuel's death to remind her of what he called her place. For 1 second, Miriam was back beside her husband's hospital bed watching a monitor measure what neither of them could stop. Samuel had hated public cruelty. Not loud cruelty, the quieter kind that counted on decent people being too uncomfortable to interfere. She would not let Nolan attach that ugliness to his memory. Miriam kept her voice even. "My name is on the reservation. Someone made a mistake." No. Someone removed the place card. A chair scraped behind Nolan. Evelyn Hart had begun crossing the ballroom. He noticed, but did not retreat. Instead, he pressed the platinum card flat against Miriam's tray and told her she poured water while he ran the room. Miriam glanced past him at the head table. The arrangement had begun failing exactly as the approved roster predicted. Arthur Dane was preparing to leave after dessert. Dr. Saye had been pulled away by another trustee. Louise Grant sat too far from the transplant family to hear their conversation. Evelyn's place at the far end left her separated from the donors she needed to guide through the appeal. In less than 20 minutes, the lights would fall, and the pledge sequence would begin inside a room Nolan had built for photographs rather than giving. Miriam reached into her service folder. His hand closed over it. "Whatever complaint you think you're making can wait until tomorrow." "It can't. The appeal starts in 20 minutes. "I know." That answer unsettled him. He tried to pull the folder away, but Miriam held it firmly. "I told you," he said loud enough for Evelyn to hear as she approached. "This employee is confused." The word employee was deliberate. It reduced 31 years of judgment, 3 weeks of planning, and every donor request she had preserved to a uniform and a payroll number. Then Nolan crossed the final line. He opened the folder himself. The foundation dinner roster rested on top. Beneath it was the reconstructed donor seating change log, including the signed freeze order, and every alteration made after approval. His eyes moved across the first page. "You copied restricted foundation documents. I created them. You had no authority. Evelyn approved the work. You are a server. And tonight's donors are leaving because you refused to serve them." A donor near the aisle gave a low breath of surprise. Nolan's face tightened. He seized the roster and lifted it as though displaying evidence against her. "This is exactly the problem," he said to the gathering witnesses. "She has been interfering for weeks, calling donors, rewriting tables, and pretending she had a role she was never given." Miriam did not interrupt him. Every accusation revealed another piece of the work he had denied knowing existed. Evelyn reached the table. Nolan pushed the roster toward her. "I recommend she be removed immediately." Evelyn accepted the pages. Her eyes settled on her own signature beneath the frozen seating order. Then on Miriam's. Then on Nolan's. The first course continued moving around the room, but the servers nearest the head table slowed. Donors shifted in their chairs. A camera operator angled slightly away from the stage. Nolan mistook Evelyn's silence for support. "She has caused enough disruption," he said. "Security can escort her out before the appeal." Miriam slid one final sheet from the folder. It was the last page of the seating log, time-stamped 6:42 p.m. Beside 19 unauthorized changes was the same set of initials, NV. She placed it on top of the roster. "I am not asking you to believe me," Miriam said to Evelyn. "I am asking you to compare the room he approved with the room the donors requested." Arthur Dane left his seat and approached the table. "I can confirm one of those requests," he said. Louise Grant rose behind him. "So can I." Nolan's hand paused over the papers. I had expected Miriam to defend her dignity. He had not expected the donors to defend the record. And when Evelyn Hart lifted the roster toward the ballroom lights, the first undeniable sign of the truth was not the signature at the bottom. It was the handwritten title across the top in Evelyn's own ink. "Final Pledge Plan prepared by Miriam Bell." Nolan stared at the handwritten title as though the ink might rearrange itself if he waited long enough. Then he gave a short laugh. "This proves nothing," he said. Miriam made notes. Staff make notes all the time. Evelyn Hart kept the roster beneath the ballroom light. "My handwriting is at the top. You approved a draft. I approved the final pledge plan." Nolan pointed towards the tables. "And I made necessary executive adjustments." Arthur Dane moved nearer. "Was separating me from Dr. Saye one of those adjustments?" Nolan's expression changed immediately. "Mr. Dane, your placement reflected your position as our leading benefactor. My position was beside the surgeon who saved my daughter." The reply landed without force, which made it harder to dismiss. Arthur removed his reading glasses from his breast pocket and held out his hand. Evelyn gave him the roster. He found his name beside Dr. Saya's and traced the notation written underneath. "Requested direct access before appeal. Confirmed twice." That is what my office asked for, he said. Nolan's voice remained polished. There were competing priorities. No, Arthur replied. There was one request and you ignored it. Louise Grant approached from the aisle. Her handbag remained hooked over one wrist. In her other hand, she carried the printed place card that had sent her to the back of the ballroom. My original seat is here, she said, indicating table 7 on Miriam's roster, beside the transplant family. Nolan barely glanced at her. Mrs. Grant, seating must reflect campaign strategy. Louise's chin lifted. I have supported this hospital since before you knew its address. A few donors murmured agreement. Nolan tried to reclaim the room. Everyone is reacting to incomplete information. Mrs. Bell has spent weeks interfering with operations and creating duplicate documents. That is the issue. Miriam opened the service folder again. She did not rush. The central roster slid across the head table toward Evelyn. It contained the donor connections, accessibility needs, confirmed requests, and pledge sequence Miriam had built after Nolan's original arrangement drove major supporters toward withdrawal. No accusations appeared in the margins, only solutions. Evelyn read the first page, then the second. At table 4, Miriam had placed the transplant family beside the pediatric surgeon who had introduced them. At table 7, Louise Grant sat among longtime supporters who had agreed to match smaller pledges. At the head table, Arthur Dane sat beside Dr. Saye and across from the hospital trustee leading the cardiac campaign. Evelyn's own chair had been positioned where she could reach the stage, the patient family, and the largest confirmed donors without crossing service traffic. The sequence was not designed to flatter anyone. It was designed to help them give. This is the version we used to recover the cancellations, Evelyn said. Nolan's smile vanished. Miriam remained beside the table. 3 donors had threatened to withdraw, she explained. Arthur Dane had been promised access to Dr. Sayegh. Louise Grant had been moved away from the family she wanted to support. The patient speakers had no clear route to the stage. The pledge cards would have crossed the dinner service twice. Nolan interrupted. You are describing ordinary banquet details. They were ordinary until they began costing the foundation money. A trustee named Robert Keene left his chair near the stage and joined them. I was on the emergency call with Evelyn, he said. The 3 donors returned after the revised arrangement was circulated. Nolan faced him. You were told I prepared the revisions. Robert's brow tightened. No, we were told a staff planner had rebuilt them overnight. A staff planner, Nolan repeated, not Miriam specifically. Evelyn closed the roster. I kept her name out of the board call because she asked me to. That silenced him for a moment. Miriam had not concealed her work to create a dramatic reveal. She had done it because she wanted the donor conversations protected from internal politics, and because she did not need a public title to complete the job. Nolan had mistaken that restraint for absence. Evelyn placed the roster at the center of the head table. This dinner was 6 days from losing its anchor donors, she said. Miriam redesigned the seating, rebuilt the pledge flow, corrected accessibility failures, and personally reconfirmed the requests your office neglected. Nolan's eyes moved from Evelyn to the gathering donors. You allowed a banquet server to contact major benefactors. I allowed the person who understood the event to repair it. His voice rose. She exceeded her role. Miriam removed the supporting log from the folder. This shows the role I was given. The donor seating change log was less elegant than the roster. Its pages were covered in times, initials, reasons, and signatures. That was why it mattered. The roster showed what Miriam had built. The log showed what Nolan had undone. Evelyn read the entries aloud. June 8th, Arthur Dane moved beside Dr. Saye. Request confirmed by assistant. Approved E.H. She moved down the page. June 9th, Louise Grant restored to table 7. Approved E.H. Then she reached the frozen roster order. June 12th, no further changes without written reason and authorization. Below it were 3 signatures. Evelyn Hart, Miriam Bell, Nolan Voss. Nolan leaned over the table. I signed an administrative form. That does not mean every later adjustment was improper. Miriam placed the final page beside it. 19 changes were entered after the freeze. They were operational decisions. Then, where are the reasons? He scanned the page. The reason column was empty beside 17 entries. 2 contained the phrase, executive presentation. Every line carried his initials. Robert Keene took the page. What does executive presentation mean? Nolan answered too quickly. It means placing priority donors where they would receive proper recognition. Arthur Dane's voice hardened. You used my donation to justify ignoring my request. I placed you at the center. You placed me where the cameras could find me. Across the ballroom, one of those cameras remained angled toward the head table. Nolan noticed it and lowered his voice. This discussion should happen privately. Miriam met his gaze. You made it public when you took the card from my hand. His jaw tightened. He reached for the log. Evelyn moved it out of reach. Nolan, do not touch these documents. That was the moment the room understood before he did. The issue was no longer whether Miriam belonged at the head table. It was whether Nolan still belonged in charge of the event. He attempted one final recovery. We have an appeal beginning in minutes. Removing the captain now would be reckless. Miriam checked the old silver watch on her wrist. 12 minutes. Nolan gave her a cold smile. And who do you imagine will run it? I will. The answer was not loud. It did not need to be. Evelyn studied her. Can the approved sequence still be restored? Not completely. The printed cards are already placed. What can be saved? Miriam opened the roster to the marked diagram. Move Arthur Dane beside Dr. Saye. Return Louise Grant to table 7. Shift the transplant family to the aisle. Bring your chair back to the center left position. Remove the tall arrangements from the head table. The remaining guests can stay where they are. How long? 7 minutes if the servers receive one clear instruction. Nolan scoffed. You cannot reseat this room during dinner. Miriam faced the service team standing nearby. Tessa, take table 7. Move the corporate guest to the open seat beside Robert Keene and explain that the chair has a clearer stage view. Daniel, remove the white rose arrangements. 2 at a time, no glassware. Ask Dr. Saye to join Mr. Dane before dessert plates are cleared. The servers moved before Nolan could countermand her. They trusted her because every instruction answered the next problem before it appeared. Miriam approached Louise herself. Your original chair is ready. Louise touched her arm. Only if no one is humiliated to make room. No one will be. At the head table, Arthur's place setting shifted beside Dr. Saye's. The tall roses vanished, opening a clear line across the donors. Evelyn's chair returned to the position marked on Miriam's plan. The ballroom did not descend into chaos. It settled. Nolan watched the transformation with the expression of a man seeing his authority separated from his usefulness. Evelyn removed the event captain pin from his lapel. It was a small action, almost invisible beyond the nearest tables. You are relieved of event leadership effective immediately, she said. You will remain off the ballroom floor while the board reviews the unauthorized changes and your treatment of staff. His face tightened. You cannot do this in front of donors. I would have preferred not to. Nolan glanced toward Robert. This is an overreaction. Robert folded the seating log. It is an emergency operational decision. The formal review begins tomorrow. Security was not summoned. No one dragged Nolan from the room. A foundation administrator escorted him through the side doors while 2 board members documented the handoff. The consequence was immediate, but the judgment would be procedural, exactly as Miriam wanted. Evelyn picked up the bent platinum reservation card from the tray. She smoothed its edge and returned it to Miriam. This seat was reserved for you, she said. Miriam glanced at her black service jacket. The appeal still needs someone running the floor. You have been running it for 3 weeks. Evelyn pulled out the empty chair at the head table. Then she addressed the donors nearest the stage. Before we begin, there is someone this foundation failed to recognize properly. The microphone carried her voice through the ballroom. Conversations ended. This dinner nearly lost several of its central supporters. Miriam Bell rebuilt the donor seating, corrected the pledge sequence, and preserved the relationships tonight depends on. She did this while continuing to serve the room, and while receiving none of the authority her work deserved. Miriam felt hundreds of eyes settle on her. This was the kind of attention she had avoided her entire career. Evelyn continued. She is not seated here because of wealth. She is seated here because service is the reason this foundation exists. Arthur Dane stood first. Louise Grant followed. Then Dr. Sayeg and the transplant family rose. The applause spread without spectacle. It was steady, warm, and long enough that Miriam had to lower her eyes for a moment. She placed the platinum card beside the head table setting and sat in the chair Nolan had tried to erase. 7 minutes later, the lights dimmed. The patient family reached the stage without obstruction. Louise Grant gave the first matching pledge. Arthur Dane doubled his planned contribution after Dr. Saye explained the cardiac program's need. The pledge cards moved cleanly through the room. By the time the final total appeared on the screen, the foundation had exceeded its goal. And at the head table, Miriam Bell did not celebrate as though she had defeated a man. She watched the hospital number rise, pressed one finger against Samuel's old silver watch, and knew the dinner had finally become what it was always supposed to be. A room where service mattered more than status. The formal review began the next morning. Nolan did not return to the ballroom. The foundation froze his event leadership duties. While board members examined the signed roster, the donor seating change logged staff statements and the unauthorized changes entered after the seating freeze. No one promised Miriam an instant result. Evelyn Hart told her only what the process could support. Nolan will have an opportunity to respond, she said, but he will not supervise you or any other foundation staff while the review is open. For Miriam, that mattered more than a dramatic punishment. She had spent years in workplaces where cruelty survived because the person reporting it still had to return the next morning and accept instructions from the same supervisor. This time, the institution drew a boundary before asking her to endure another shift. 2 servers submitted written accounts of Nolan hiding access badges and humiliating staff in front of guests. The rental manager confirmed that he had refused the emergency glass order. Arthur Dane's assistant provided copies of the seating requests Nolan claimed had never been made. Louise Grant wrote only 3 sentences. A foundation that asks ordinary people to give must not treat ordinary workers as invisible. Her letter was read aloud at the board meeting. Before the week ended, Nolan was removed permanently from event leadership. His banquet employment was suspended pending the catering company's separate review. The board did not accuse him of crimes he had not committed. It documented failures of judgment, retaliation, unauthorized operational changes, and degrading treatment of staff. The consequences were precise. So was the correction. The foundation created a written approval process for donor seating changes. Service employees received direct access to the foundation office when safety, accessibility, or donor commitments were at risk. Staff names were added to planning records whenever their work shaped an event. Evelyn also offered Miriam a new position. Not director, not executive, nothing exaggerated enough to feel like charity. The title was Foundation Event Logistics Coordinator, 24 hours a week with medical coverage, paid planning time, and the authority to train service teams before major dinners. Miriam read the offer twice. I still want to work the floor, she said. Evelyn smiled. I assumed you would. People make different decisions once the room fills. That is why we need you there. The salary would not make Miriam wealthy. It would, however, cover her rent, groceries, and the remaining monthly payment from Samuel's treatment without forcing her to accept every late banquet shift offered across the city. For the first time since his illness, she could look at the next month without calculating which bill would have to wait. She accepted. 3 weeks later, Miriam returned to the same ballroom for a smaller hospital luncheon. The crystal lights were dimmer in daylight. No orchestra played. The tables held simple blue flowers instead of towering white roses. Miriam arrived before sunrise, as she always had. But this time, a planning folder waited at her place in the foundation office. Her name was printed on the front. Inside were the guest roster, accessibility request, pledge schedule, and a blank changelog with clear approval lines. No one had hidden her work beneath another person's title. She spent the morning guiding a new service team through the room. Do not rank problems by how important the guest appears, she told them. A blocked aisle matters before a large donation. A confused family matters before a photograph. Fix what prevents the room from serving its purpose. Tessa, now training as an assistant captain, wrote the sentence in the margin of her notes. At noon, Louise Grant arrived carrying a small envelope. She found Miriam beside table 7. I brought something for you. Inside was a photocopy of the first foundation receipt Louise had received 22 years earlier. The donation had been $25. I wanted you to see where important donors begin, Louise said. Miriam laughed softly. I never forgot. Arthur Dane sent no gift. He sent a note confirming that his increased cardiac program pledge would be made in honor of the surgical team and Samuel Bell. Miriam read Samuel's name 3 times before folding the note. She kept it behind his photograph in her wallet. The platinum reservation card remained there too, though Evelyn had offered to replace the one Nolan bent. Miriam refused. She pressed the card beneath a heavy book for several nights until it lay almost flat again. A faint crease still crossed the engraved name. She liked it that way. It no longer represented a place she could not afford to accept. It reminded her that dignity did not become real only after powerful people recognized it. It had been hers when she counted chipped glasses in the basement. It had been hers when Nolan removed her badge. It had been hers while she stood beside the head table holding an empty tray. The card had never created her worth. It had only forced the room to confront what it had failed to see. Months later, the hospital foundation announced that its dinner proceeds had funded temporary housing for 32 patient families, transportation assistance for rural patients, and emergency treatment grants. Miriam requested that no program be named after her. Instead, she helped establish a small annual award for service workers whose behind-the-scenes decisions protected patients, guests, or coworkers. The first recipient was a dishwasher who had noticed a damaged electrical cable near a wet kitchen floor and stopped service before anyone was injured. He accepted the award in a borrowed jacket and said he had only done his job. Miriam understood. The people holding a room together rarely believed they were doing anything heroic. They noticed what could fail. Then they acted before everyone else had to notice, too. Nolan never returned to foundation events. His review remained in his employment record, and he lost the authority he had treated as proof of superiority. Miriam did not follow what happened after that. Healing did not require watching him fall farther. It required building a room where the next quiet worker would not need public humiliation before being heard. At the end of the spring luncheon, Miriam remained after the guests had gone. She straightened one chair near the head table, collected a forgotten pledge card, and switched off the final row of lights. The ballroom softened into shadow. Before leaving, she opened her wallet. Samuel's photograph rested behind the platinum card, and Arthur Dane's folded note rested behind them both. Miriam touched the crease across her name. Then she closed the wallet, placed it inside her service jacket, and walked through the main doors instead of the kitchen exit. Because service and status are not the same thing. One is measured by where a person sits. The other is revealed by what remains standing because they were there. Have you ever seen someone treated as unimportant simply because of the work they did? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about quiet people whose true value could not stay hidden forever.